What I want to talk about is actually, I think, really important to the kinds of things that Mary Evelyn was just talking about, because in order to be able to get in touch with those energies and that spirituality and so forth, people need to have certain material conditions of life. I'm going to talk briefly about one of those, which is consumption, and then I'm going to move to time. And of course, consuming and time use are very intimately connected, but I think they are part of a culture of busyness, distraction, et cetera, that are part of the problem, both on a spiritual and cultural level, but also on an economic level. And that's, I'm going to take us up to the macro. I know people have spent a lot of time talking about households and individuals, and this is a talk about big economic relationships and what we need to be, some of the things we need to be thinking about to solve the kinds of problems that we're interested in. So we all know that we are in unsustainable territory in terms of ecological footprints and carbon footprints. We've gone into ecological overshoot. Now, the standard economic answer to that is don't worry about it. Growth will solve the problem. This is what's called the environmental Kuznets curve, but it's basically the idea that when you're a poorer country, you degrade the environment. China is a typical example. But as you get richer, you clean up your environment. Environment is a luxury good. You buy more of it. Trade-off between growth and environment in this, on this part of the curve. Now, it turns out that for climate, it's completely wrong. It's not wrong. It's not right for very much. For climate, it's absolutely wrong, which is that the more you grow, the more you emit. So we can't rely on that sort of inherent optimism of mainstream economics. Instead, people think about the well-known iPad, and I'm sorry here, the switch messed up my margins a little on my slides. Well-known iPad equation that ecological impact is a product of population, affluence, and technology, where affluence basically means consumption or its other side, production. Now, almost all of the conversation for a long time in this country, particularly the more official conversation, has been focused on technology. So new energy sources, et cetera. And affluence and its close cousin growth are pretty much taboo subjects. So it's very hard to talk about the idea of reducing people's consumption or slowing down the growth of the economy. And yet, one of the things we know is that our technological progress in decarbonization or dematerialization, it's been about 1.2, 1.4%. We're doing a little better now, but why? Because we've had a big growth slowdown. That if our population growth is larger than our technological progress, or our rate of growth of the scale of the economy is larger, we keep wiping out the gains that we made, and we're not making progress. So I want to talk about affluence, something that people are increasingly understanding has to be part of the equation. I'm going to go very quickly through one quick case. And this is from work I did looking at what was going on in the consumption regime, or the people's consumption patterns in the 10 years in the run-up to the financial collapse. So 97 through 2007, roughly speaking. I got interested because of clothing, and I've done work like this across the whole manufacturing sector. So the story of clothing is one that is repeated in consumer electronics, in furniture, in glassware, in ceramics, in household, gizmos, doodads, et cetera, all across manufacturing. So the average American increased the number of pieces of clothing that he or she purchased, new clothing, between 1991 and 2007, basically doubled the number of pieces of clothing. Why? A lot of reasons, but lower prices has been one of them, changing practices of the retailers and so forth. But we had big increases in the number of garments purchased. This, by the way, is outerwear, and underwear does not include my stockinged feet, hosiery and socks. So, I mean, it's an unprecedented number of pieces of clothing. And if we looked on the other side, one of the things that followed it is the new clothes, particularly the imports. A lot of these were imports. The imports that people purchased, new imports predicted the amount that they threw away or discarded. These are discards that actually go into a secondary market of used apparel, which now we are exporting lots and lots of used apparel. So it was a huge growth industry over this period. And if you go to places like Africa and Southeast Asia and so forth, you will see lots of people walking around in American clothes, repurposed often. So we developed what I called a fast fashion model, people acquiring and discarding at a rapid rate. And in fact, if you look over that period, at an accelerated rate. It's enormously unsustainable. And I start with it because it's an incredible example of how our economic system has gone awry on two really important dimensions. So this is a used clothing store not far from my house. It now sells clothing by the pound for $1.50 a pound, used clothing. At the time I wrote the book, it was $1 a pound, but the recession, of course, reduces the supply and increases the demand, so the price went up. But this is a picture of something that is of world historic importance, because the idea that you could purchase clothing at $1 or $1.50 a pound, so cheaper than rice or beans, basic cheap commodities, is mind-boggling if you know anything about the history of apparel, which is that apparel is a very costly commodity all the way through history until right now, at least through, modern history. In fact, why is it so costly? It requires a lot of labor and it requires a lot of natural resources to produce it. Whether we're talking about cotton, which is very hard on the soil, or we're talking about synthetics, which use the petroleums, a lot of water in the dyes. I mean, wool, whatever, there are many different textiles, but they're all very labor and resource intensive. So apparel was always a very valuable commodity, and in fact, it served as a currency, an informal currency in times when people didn't have enough currency. So you could take your clothing and get actual cash money for it, pawn it for people who worked in those informal currency markets all the way well into the 20th century. There are stories like Welsh miners who would pawn their Sunday suit on Monday to get food, to keep money, to keep them through the week, and then after their paycheck would come and they'd get it back out so they could wear it on Sunday. So the fact that used clothing, not only $1 a pound, but in fact, by the end of the boom, used clothing was so worthless that it became hard to even give it away. So it had a zero value. So we have an economic system which is putting a zero price on commodities which are extremely labor and resource intensive. That is a system totally out of whack. And the fact that we are degrading our ecosystems and, threatening human civilization as we know it is not a surprise when you look at exactly how the system is working. Okay, so in the United States, and this is a measure not of, I was measuring final goods. If you look at the total material consumption, that's all the materials flows that go behind what people buy, the objects, items that they're purchasing, which are, a small, the weight of that computer is a very small fraction of the total material flow that went into it. One of the things that's happening is we are still increasing material flows quite substantially around the world because we have demand going up and we're not dematerializing rapidly enough. The average American, the total material flows associated with this economy. So this is all of the whole production of the economy, and we're allocating it to consumers. So also what businesses and governments are consuming. 88 kgs per day, 88 kgs per day of material consumption. So that's the fossil fuels, the weight of the fossil fuels, the weight of the biomass, et cetera, et cetera. Twice what average Europeans consume. Africans, just 10, of course, and Asians, about 14. So we're way off the charts in terms of our material consumption, and you can see it also in our CO2 numbers and our eco-footprint and all of those things. So the question is, how do we get a handle on that? And what I want to talk about today is one of the variables that I believe is essential. It's a necessary but not sufficient variable on which we need movement if we are actually to get to sustainable levels of economic activity, production, and consumption, and that is working time. And it's one that has been off the agenda almost totally for a long time. I wrote a book on working time 20 years ago, and at that time, people were very interested in it. It was something that was on the agenda. It was seen as a social problem. Today, it's been completely off the table, and yet it's one of the central variables that we need to address if we are going to achieve sustainability, and by the way, I will also argue if we're actually going to get our labor market back into balance, which is a whole other dimension of it. But let me start by talking about the ecological connections between how we use our time and what our eco impacts are. So this is a simple 2x2, and I'm going to show you some results from a full model. Just two variables. One is the number of hours worked per employee in the economy, and the other is the total ecological footprint. People, I assume, are all familiar with the eco-footprint measure. It's basically a measure of the society's consumption pressures by country. And each of these little things these little crosses is a country. So what it shows here, and it's because we're not controlling for other variables here, it's not such a strong relationship. We'll see it in the full model much stronger, is that the higher the working hours of a country, the higher the ecological footprint. And it's also true that the higher the working hours, the higher the carbon footprint. Now, there are two ways in which working hours affect eco-footprints, carbon footprints, and emissions. The first takes place at the household level, and we can think of it as the compositional effect, meaning households' time use situation, whether they are time stressed, if they have to work long hours and therefore don't have much free time, their time budget affects what they do, what they buy, and the kinds of practices that they engage in. So it's really important to remember, households have both time and income budgets. We mostly just think about their income budgets. We all have 24 hours in a day, so we have an egalitarian time budget in an absolute sense, but the amounts of time that people work and therefore time outside of work differs quite a lot. So households which have more time affluence, that is more free time, fewer working hours, are able to do things that are more time intensive, and in general, we believe lower impact activities are more time intensive. Higher impact activities tend to take less time. The most important example here is transport. The quicker you need to get somewhere, the more carbon you use up getting there. But there are other examples too. Food, the whole area of food preparation is another one where opting for the fast way tends to be the more carbon intensive way. So the composition effect says that things which affect households' time budgets will affect the mix of goods and services and practices that they engage in ways which are consistent with higher working hours means higher impact. Now, so that's the first of the two ways that working hours affects eco-impacts. The second is through what we call the scale effect. So let me give you an example. Let me just go through how it is that working hours affect. This is a really important variable to think about, productivity growth, because it's one of the most dynamic things in an economy. And one of the big questions for transition from one kind of an economy to another is, what do you do with your productivity growth? Because that's something, in a market economy, we're getting productivity growth every year. We have two choices. We have many choices, but two main categories of choices. We can put it toward producing more output, or we can put it toward taking more leisure time. Because what productivity growth means is that for any given amount of labor input, we can produce more. That's what a growth in productivity gives us. So if we're in a situation with fixed hours of work and we have productivity growth, what it means is that we are increasing the scale of our production. We are increasing output, which means we are production, which means we are increasing consumption, which means that if we want to do something about eco-impact, because it's coming straight from that production, we're intervening here with technology, back to that iPad equation, that T, and we are trying to counteract the impact of that rising output and consumption. So we've got to have enough technology impact, decarbonization, dematerialization, to compensate for that rising output and consumption. And as we know, we haven't been able to do that. We're not getting enough on the technology side. And we haven't been for the 25 years that we've been worrying about this. So let's look at the other way we can go, which is we can take some of that productivity growth and put it towards giving people fewer hours of work. Now, by the way, we are not reducing their incomes here. What productivity growth gives us is the opportunity to either raise output and incomes or to give people more in their time budget. So instead of putting it all to their income budget, we put it to their time budget. We reduce hours of work. That means we have less growth in output than we would have in the first scenario. You can split your productivity growth. You can put half towards growing output, half towards reducing. You can take any fraction you want and put it to either of those two things. It means that we are then boosting that technological progress that we're making, and we're going to get a lot more benefit on the eco-impact side. So that's the scale effect, because working hours affect the size of the economy, because we can think about the economy as the number of people working for a certain number of hours, each of them at any given technology that produces a certain amount of output. You could also affect it by the numbers of people that are working. So these are some results from a model of that I've estimated on the impact of working hours on eco-footprints, carbon footprints, and carbon emissions. It's a model of all of the OECD countries over the period 1970 to 2007. And it's this is just a table of effects. So I'm just going to tell you that the dependent variables, so the variables we're trying to explain are these three ecological variables: eco-footprint, carbon footprint, and carbon dioxide emissions. Now the big difference between these two is that the carbon footprint is a consumption-based measure. So it's the amount of carbon embedded in the consumption of the country. The emissions is a production-based measure. So that's your national emissions. If you're importing a lot of carbon-intensive goods from other countries, it doesn't show up in your emissions, but it shows up in your footprint. And this is important because we get different results on these. So this is the consumption-based one, which is more relevant for this kind of an analysis. So we have controlled for population, we've controlled for percent urban, we've controlled for how much manufacturing there is in the country, we've controlled for the percentage of the economy that's in services. We've controlled for the labor productivity and the labor participation rate. So we want to control for all these things so we can isolate the impact of changes in working hours. And these are the variables that lots of studies of eco-footprint and carbon footprint have used, and I'm happy to talk about those. And we want to differentiate between these two kinds of effects that I talked about, the composition effect and the scale effect. What did we find? Well, if you reduce working hours 10%, so that is, it's like what a lot of companies do in the summer now. They give the workers on Friday afternoons, they let them go home at noon. Actually, it would be letting them go home on a 40-hour work, it would be letting them go home at 1 o'clock instead of keeping them there till 5. So that's a 10% reduction. If you reduce working hours by 10%, let's just look at carbon footprint. You get almost a 15% reduction in your carbon footprint for your scale effect, which is the bigger of the two effects, as we would expect. And you get another 8.6 for your compositional effect. So we've parsed out these two different effects. You add them together to get the full effect. So it's actually a quite substantial amount. If you did a 25% reduction, not something you would do overnight, but which you could evolve to over time, each year taking a couple of percent, taking 1 or 2% of your productivity growth and using it to reduce hours, give people longer vacations, more job sharing, put more people on 4-day weeks, and so on and so forth. So if you went all the way to that 25% reduction, which would be a day off plus a little bit more, you get a 36.6% reduction in carbon footprint and a 21.5 on the compositional effect. So you start to get some really big impacts as you move. The countries, and you can think back to that material flows diagram picture I showed you with Europe, with those much smaller rucksacks of materials. Their eco and carbon footprints are about half ours. And you think about a country like Germany, which, by the way, weathered this recession with virtually no unemployment because they adjusted hours. We did all our adjusting on output and employment. And their footprint is half what our footprint is. So we could move a long way in the direction of reducing footprint if we started to make some changes in the way the labor market works. Now, what are those kinds of changes? One of the important facts about our labor market is that it's very rigid downward on hours. It's easier for people to work longer hours, but if you want to work fewer hours in your job, typically people have to change jobs to do that. So we don't have a market in hours. If you're a market-based kind of person, you can think of this as the need to create a market in hours. Before the recession, a majority of American workers said they were working more hours than they wanted to, and on average, they were willing to give up about 10%. It's particularly true among high earners. As you move higher up, you have a lot of unfulfilled desire to trade income for time. So making more flexibility in your market to allow people to do that without jeopardizing their careers is a big part, I think. We don't often think about climate outcomes or sustainability outcomes in the context of some of these variables that look like they have nothing to do with it, like income distribution or working hours. But a lot of our economic work shows us that these are actually some of the most powerful variables that can change ecological and climate outcomes. So that's the eco side of it. There's a powerful benefit to be had there if we were able to do this. I believe there are two other benefits, and I think they're really important, particularly the second one, particularly now, and that has to do with the labor market, because as you know, our labor market is badly out of balance. And I'll just show you 1 or 2 points on that in a minute. This is a graph of 6 early industrializing countries over the period 1870 to 1970. Now, the numbers are a little bit estimated here. You see they all start in the same place. But what's what's important about this is that in 1870, the annual work year was about 3,000 hours. Today, well, we're past this now, but by 1973, here's the US, the gray one, we were down to about 1,800 hours. So we had a very long and substantial reduction in hours over this century. The reason I bring this historical experience up is that I would argue, and I think many people would agree, it would not have been possible for these countries to maintain the very high levels of employment that they were able to attain over this period, with the exception of the Great Depression. So that was the one big exception. Without hours reductions, because we had really rapid productivity growth. And think about what happens when you have that rapid productivity growth. You are displacing workers from industries, from jobs. You can do without all of that labor. And we're seeing it, incredibly happening before our eyes with the information revolution. How easy it is for technology to replace people. And that's going to keep going. I mean, we're just seeing the beginnings of that. How are we going to keep all of our people employed when we know there are now we have ecological constraints on how big the economy can get, at least in the short run? How can we keep our labor market in balance? We have always done it, in part through growing and in part through taking productivity growth in the form of shorter hours. So we had big increases in leisure time here, which also, of course, had the great benefits of giving people time off work and had community and family benefits. Now, what happened since 1973 in the United States is that unlike France and Germany, especially Netherlands, UK to a slightly lesser extent, the US kind of flatlines here in terms of hours of work. So we stopped taking productivity growth in the form of shorter hours of work. We're putting it all toward more output, because workers aren't getting the benefits and higher wages. They're going mostly to capital share as opposed to labor share. But actually, this is data from firms. So these are hours per job. If you look at it on a per person basis, because we have rising number of people with multiple jobs, which are not accounted for in that data, we actually have substantial increases in hours of work since the 1970s. We have a labor market in which we have more and more people underemployed, and we have a majority of people who are overemployed. And we talk a lot about income distribution and the unfairness of the income distribution in this country and the growing inequality. One of the things that's driving that is the growing inequality of access to work. Not work hours, not just access to jobs, but also access to hours. So some people have more hours than they want, other people don't have enough. And a key dimension of families in poverty is inadequate access to hours of work. So we went in the other direction since 1975, and it's part of why we have a labor market that is so out of balance. So we have a big drop off in employment here. This is employment to population ratio. This is the crash. We haven't recovered. The unemployment rate looks better, but part of that is we've got more and more people dropping out of the labor force. So this is the measure you want to look at, employment to population, and we have not turned around on that. And of course, we have still 25 million people who are either out of work altogether, who are involuntarily unemployed, or who are marginally attached to the labor force, meaning they're not getting counted in the unemployment statistics because they're not looking for a job in the last 2 weeks. Why? Because they're discouraged, because there are almost 4 job seekers for every available job. So we have a labor market out of balance. Because working hours are so high for the people in jobs, it is much harder to create a new job. Every new job that gets created in this country requires somewhere between 15 to 22, 23% more dollars of revenue than it does in Western Europe because their hours are shorter. So we raise the bar for job creation, as we keep hours so high. So rebalancing the labor market is also a big imperative, and shorter hours of work helps us to do that. It means we can hire more people for any given amount of revenue. And just to bring the job market issue back to the environment, look at what has happened as a result of the poor labor market situation. I mean, we know, if we're following the presidential election and so forth, how important the economy and jobs and so forth is to where people are at. This is a question that Gallup has been asking since 1985. Do you have a higher priority for economic development or environmental protection? Well, environmental protection vastly outpolled economy. In 1985, it was 61 to 28. We have just, for the first time, crossed. And now economy has a higher, public says economy and jobs is more important than environment. We cannot afford to lose this. We have to have a strategy on climate that also is a strategy that improves labor market. We need a double dividend strategy on climate, absolutely. And it can't just be one about how we can grow faster with new technologies, because we've already talked about that. It's got to be something else. So how could we actually do it? We had a lot of good questions in the last session about in practice. So this is a list of policy options. 50 years ago, you would have tried, or in the Depression, you tried to do it by getting the federal government to pass a law to reduce the work week. That's not the way work time reduction will happen in this country. And there are a variety of issues with that. It's not on the agenda. But let's think more creatively about a package of policy options that could actually get us to the direction that we're looking for, which is reductions in average hours. So in the Netherlands, facing very high unemployment in the early 1980s as a result of that big slump in the 80s, big manufacturing decline, 1980, worldwide recession, the Dutch government decided that all new hiring it would take people at 80%. So they got paid 80% of a full-time salary and they worked 4 days. Now, for the people who were getting hired, they were going from, many of them, they were school leavers, so many of them were going from no income to an 80%. So it was still a big, for them, 80% salary was fine. It's not as if you were taking people from 100 and now saying you've got to have 80. You can't take income away from people that they already have. They hate it. There's a backlash to it. It's a terrible way to do things. But giving people a little bit less than they might have in some hypothetical alternative works pretty well. This generation of people who got hired loves 4-day work weeks. It had a lot of other tremendous benefits. Eventually, the entire financial sector of the Netherlands went on to a 4-day work week. Amazing to think about in a country like this, what it would take to get our Wall Street to get onto that. So, new hires at 80%. You can start with governments, where governments are hiring. I know we don't have a lot going on. Or you can give tax credits to companies that hire at 80%. Many young people, particularly those who are going to get higher salaries, who, by the way, also have higher carbon footprints, are interested in time. And they are particularly dual earner families for whom a 4-day work week is a tremendous work perk. Voluntary trades of time and salary for high-income workers. I've mentioned this already. There's a lot of latent demand for that. The right to a short-hour job. One of the things the Dutch and other countries have done is make it illegal for a company to refuse a person to reduce their hours of work. So they have a right, except under certain, there are always, exceptions, but you have a right to ask for fewer hours of work in your job, and if you do, that it will not derail your career. So there are some legal things we could do. One of the things that people have paid increasing attention to is using the unemployment insurance to subsidize short time work. So instead of a factory laying off 20% of its workers. It reduces everybody by 20%. They all get some unemployment insurance to compensate for that income loss. A number of companies did this in 2008 when the economy declined so much. It's only, the federal government allows it. There are only 20-some states now which do. There was a bill in Congress to make that something available to workers in all states. Business has been actually not at all opposed to this in the states where they've passed these laws since the downturn. Tax credits for employers who provide short hours, and contracts tying hours reductions to productivity growth. So that's another thing. You increase your productivity growth, you're going to get that back in shorter hours. So, and we can talk more about this. There are a lot of other policy options that have been tried on small scales and in other countries which can be used. It's basically a suite of policies which put a lot more choice into the labor market, at least for some of them, which can do this. So last slide is shorter hours have a triple dividend, and these are the kinds of approaches that we need. We cannot, single dividend approaches won't work for what we're facing. Shorter hours reduce eco and carbon footprints. They lead to lower unemployment and more job creation. And of course, there are also a whole other range of benefits that people get. Give them more time for free time, reduce stress, enhance family life and community, enable political activity. And now after listening to Mary Evelyn, I'm going to add and enhance spiritual practice. Thank you.